Hello, Michael Williams here. Good evening to all of you on this day after the election. I'm joined by Dr. Kevin Wagner, who heads the Political Science Department at Florida Atlantic University. FAU has done its own share of polling in the election cycle. We'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Professor, we thank you for being with us this day. Florida is not the center of attention right now. It was a smooth election. Everything went well in Palm Beach County, which has been the epicenter of issues over the years, but went very smoothly. Wendy Sartori-Link, who was appointed by Governor Ron DeSantis after problems with the midterm, getting kudos, as is her staff. And throughout the state, Florida is actually being looked at today as a bit of a role model for getting things done. Talk about the mechanics of why it worked smoothly in Florida, Professor, because it's a good jumping off point for what we're seeing in other states and what we might expect. But talk about the mechanics of why Florida seems to have found a way, at least this cycle, to make things run smoothly and get the votes counted quickly and move on.
Yeah, you know, one of the good things about having trouble in the past is that we've faced and addressed a lot of the issues that we're seeing other states have. Florida was somewhat notorious going back to 2000 for having some difficulty with vote counting, and I don't want to cause anybody to have any flashbacks, but we remember pregnant chads and hanging chads, and what the intent of the voter is, and all that kind of thing that was going on in 2000. The real key really is that if it's a closer election, you get greater scrutiny. And in this particular case, we're talking about a 3-point win for President Trump, which isn't a huge number, but for Florida, that's a pretty good margin. So you're not going to spend a lot of time trying to find a handful of ballots that maybe were rejected that should have been counted. So to some degree, part of the success today is that it was a distance, it was a big enough margin that we don't have to sort of start putting a magnifying glass. With that said, a very, very good job all the way around by Florida does well at mail-in balloting. It does well in it counts, it tabulates before election day, unlike Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. So a lot of things that we do very, very effectively, and I thought we saw that today and yesterday.
Polarized comments already coming in, not surprisingly. One person said, and we need to speak to, frankly, what's true, what's not, what fact versus fiction here. Some are saying, this has been in, Democrats have planned to defraud us out of this election. It's been in the planning for years. Florida went smoothly. Let's pull up the electoral map because it's a good piece of the conversation. But speak to these issues and concerns that Republicans, including the president, are saying we're being defrauded here. Speak to the facts on the ground.
Yeah, I don't think there's any evidence of fraud, and it's important when we throw those terms out that we make sure that they're based on facts and not just the desire to have one side or the other win. Part of the problem, the reason that we're still having vote counts in a place like Pennsylvania, is because Pennsylvania has a very different system than Florida. In Florida, they tabulate the mail-in ballots well before election day, so when they get them, we're gonna be releasing our results pretty quickly on election day. In Pennsylvania, they're not even opening these ballots until election day, and we've actually seen that some counties have said in Pennsylvania that they're not even opening them until the day after election. So it's going to take some. So just because it takes time for Pennsylvania or other states to do their count doesn't mean that there's any malfeasance in there. I mean, California, for example, you can mail, under the laws in California, you can mail your ballot to California on election day. So, obviously, because of that, California is going to take a little bit longer to do it. Every state has their own rules. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there any indication of widespread fraud in state or national elections?
No, I haven't seen any. There's a high.
In fact, I use the term widespread. Most studies indicate there's no indication of systemic fraud in elections, period. Doesn't mean we don't have problems at times. So I shouldn't even use the word widespread. But fundamentally to this argument some are making that there's fraud here, is there any indication of systemic fraud impacting U.S. elections?
There are some complaints on both sides. I think Democrats are complaining about deliveries from the post office, and I think Republicans are complaining about ballots being counted later in the next day. Anytime you have a legitimate complaint, those kinds of things should be investigated. And I think in the case of the post office, certainly they are investigating, and I think a judge is supervising that investigation. And there's so much scrutiny on Pennsylvania and Michigan and Nevada and Arizona. If there's going to be a problem, we'll know about it.
But I want to be clear, problems, yes, it's a big sprawling 50-state conglomeration, 67 separate voting offices or voting supervisors in Florida alone. Problems, yes, and a battery of lawyers on both sides will deal with that, but that's different than overt systemic fraud. And my read of studies is there's no indication of that. And that's happening for some time. And a number of studies suggest that simply is not a prime issue in elections in this country. Am I correct?
Yeah, the research on this, and it's sort of there's been a lot of work to try and find any type of ballot fraud in the United States, because there are political implications for that on how we vote and the methodology we use for voting. So there's been commissions, there's been research projects, and no one has been able to find any real levels of systematic fraud in the United States. Mistakes, sometimes problems, sometimes somebody makes an error, that happens, but no systematic attempt to defraud the U.S. vote.
Again, the Florida vote went smoothly, 29 electoral votes to President Trump. We'll talk about the lay of the land politically for Florida. Again, to be clear, though, mail-in ballots and early voting did not begin with this election. Mail-in voting, early voting, it's been with us. It's part of the process. Each state decides how long they'll take the ballots, and we've seen nothing there, correct me if I'm wrong, that anything out of the ordinary except the outsized attention being paid to this election. Is that a correct analysis?
Yeah, that's correct. And in fact, Florida's been doing mail-in balloting for a long time. We're relatively good at it. The kind of irony, Michael, is that the mail-in balloting has generally been more favorable for Republicans. Historically in Florida, Republicans are more likely to use mail-in balloting. Democrats were a little more likely to use early in-person balloting. A little bit different this year because of the pandemic, but no one's ever suggested there was any kind of systematic fraud with the system. We've been doing it a long time.
And in fact, it's Republicans in Florida who pushed hard for mail-in voting.
They did, and I think you saw that the supervisor of elections have a lot of experience with it, and they handled it relatively well.
As we look at the map, and I would ask any of you at home if you have a specific question about how the counting in other states will unfold, how the legal battle will unfold, we're with Professor Kevin Wagner, who heads up the Florida Atlantic University Political Science Department, has been a familiar face with us for many years. And we'll talk a bit more about Florida and what happened. Democrats in Florida are licking their political wounds now. The president did very, very well, especially with the Cuban-American vote in Miami that helped power him to a big victory in Florida, 29 electoral votes, the third biggest prize, tied with New York for the third biggest electoral prize on election night. But as we look at the map, sir, this is from NBC, and we're not going beyond their tally. Right now, just to look at the map, Arizona, Nevada. Arizona has 11 electoral votes to give. Right now, waiting to see how that will be called with Mr. Biden. I can't quite see it above the question there, but Mr. Biden slight lead. Nevada with 6 to give. As NBC pointed out, should he emerge victorious there, that would be enough votes, according to the NBC current calculations, to put him at 270 without Pennsylvania, without Georgia, North Carolina, that are still being debated. Michigan with 16 electoral votes has, on the strength of huge mail-in balloting going on right now, especially in urban areas around Detroit. You see the numbers there for Joe Biden, the challenger. Wisconsin with 10 electoral votes to give. That's a race that almost certainly will go to a recount. The president has asked for one there, and within the letter of the law there, it may well be required because the margin's so close in Wisconsin. Again, 10 electoral votes to give there, 16 to give in Michigan. And when you look at Pennsylvania, where again, a lot of votes yet to be tallied, the president has a lead there, although it has been pointed out that perhaps somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million mail-in or early votes are still yet to be counted, many of them in heavily populated areas where Democrats would seem to have sway. Doesn't mean it'll change the numbers, but as we look at that as a backdrop, it's really what we talked about before the election, that this would be an election where early or mail-in ballots might tend to favor the Democrat, day of voting the Republican. So again, are we seeing anything out of the ordinary in this quote unquote late surge that has Democrats hopeful and has Republicans saying what's going on here? Put it in perspective.
Yeah, I don't think we would have spent a lot of time worrying about Pennsylvania if the map hadn't been so tight. But the way that, there was an attempt to change the law in Pennsylvania so that they could start tabulating the mail-in ballots earlier, so they could have a similar process to what we have in Florida and get everything released earlier. But the legislature in Pennsylvania did not want to do that. So as a consequence of that, Pennsylvania is just going to take longer. they had many more mail-in ballots, or sometimes in Pennsylvania they allow you to fill out your ballot and then basically hand it in. And so they have so many more of those than they traditionally have in Pennsylvania. They're not as used to doing that. It's just going to take them a bit more time to do it.
What I want to drive at for our viewers, though, sir, is do you have, based on obviously expert on what's going on in Florida, but do you have a sense that everything is in place to allow Republicans and Democrats to feel comfortable that votes are being legally counted, and that whatever challenges may come, there'll be enough people on both sides to make sure that all legally cast ballots are properly counted? What is the confidence you can give people? Because we're seeing the polarized opinion coming up and down my comment page here. What assurances can give people who don't get into the inside baseball of this, but want to know, how will the process work? How can we be assured, whoever we supported, that it'll be fairly counted, legally cast ballots, and that the end result, whether it's for President Trump or Joe Biden, will be one we can have faith in?
Yeah, I think most people should have faith that it's going to be done. Remember, there are going to be count observers basically from both political parties all across the state. It's not happening, without a lot of people around watching what's going on. So it's just slow. And as far as we can tell, the only really issue is that it's slow. And if it's slow and it takes a little longer to get it right, then I think most Americans are okay with that. The problem, of course, is that, we want an immediacy to an answer. And if it's not immediate, we think there must be some malfeasance. There's just no evidence there's any malfeasance going on, other than, that it's taking Pennsylvania a while to deal with a large number of absentee, mail-in style ballots that they're not used to.
That's a question about process. It's not a question, though, about malfeasance. Suzanne asked, I get this question a lot. She put in exclamation points. Standardized election process needs to be implemented immediately. Suzanne McIntyre says that. And also put in exclamation points, why don't all states have the same rules? Explain that to our viewers, because a lot of people said if Florida could get its act together, where all ballots have to be in, where they could start processing early and mail-in ballots 22 days ago or before Election Day to make it what turned out to be a very smooth process here, why not everywhere else?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The short answer to it goes back to the Constitution. And without turning this into a professorial lecture, the bottom line is this: in the Constitution, the selection of electors is left to state legislators. In other words, your legislators in your state get to choose how they're going to select their electors. Most have said we're going to do it through a general election, and then they create the rules for their general election. There's no constitutional requirement to even have an election. So obviously there's no constitutional requirements about how we're going to have that election. So fundamentally, the states get to make up the rules. That's why in California, you can cast your ballot by mail on Election Day, where in Florida, it has to be received by Election Day, because each state sort of makes their own rules.
Jody Ann asked, first person to 270. So it's the first person to 270 that wins. And in fact, that is the case. Now, there may, Jody, be, as you clearly see, a dispute about how you got to 270 and whether it holds up. The president already challenging in Wisconsin. His lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, said we may look at a nationwide lawsuit. But talk about it's 538 electoral votes out there. So to 270, you're the winner. Right now, Joe Biden at 253, according to the NBC count. Still waiting for results in Arizona, Nevada, final results, Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan.
I don't want to make this even more complicated, but I guess I will throw out here.
Go ahead.
They're electors, right? So Florida selects a group of electors submitted by the Republican Party because Donald Trump won the state. And then they go cast their ballot 41 days after Election Day. And then those ballots are counted, and whoever gets to 270 there wins. Now, it's worth pointing out that from time to time, I don't even know if I want to go here, Michael, but I guess I'm going to go here. From time to time, we have what we call faithless electors, which are people that cast ballots for the wrong candidate or not the candidate they're supposed to cast it for. And the only reason I bring it up is if it's really close. Yeah, if it's really close, we might have a situation where one or two faithless electors could create a problem. I will concede this following truth, just so everyone doesn't get too up in arms. We haven't had a faithless elector change the outcome yet, but we do have them.
And in fact, there was, I believe, a law, and this was looked at again last year. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a high court ruling that established that you had to, as an elector, follow the popular vote. There was law on this earlier this year, as my memory serves.
So it's a little more nuanced than that. What the Supreme Court did
Well,
was
you're the professor.
yeah, as is in the case of all these things, right? The Supreme Court upheld state statutes that mandate that the elector vote for the candidate in which they were committed to when they were selected on that group, that slate of electors. And it also said that state sanctions against them for not doing it would be illegal. But it's worth pointing out, not every state has such a law, and even some of the states that have that law, they don't have any sanction for it. So,
Well,
so there's still some room here.
Yeah, we're going to go down a rabbit hole on electors
Yeah.
that really has not traditionally been a problem. You at least put it out there. We'll put a little sticky note by it, but certainly that as we stay in the here and now, talk about process for people in a streamlined fashion, because you and I, we love to talk politics and can get very inside baseball. But for people who say, what happens now? We hear cries about going to the U.S. Supreme Court. We hear about lawsuits happening. In a very simple way, as a political scientist, outline the structure of how challenges would happen and how they would work their way up the court system and what the judiciary would look for in terms of pivot points upon which to make a decision.
Yeah, so it's actually fairly complicated, and but
Simplify it.
let me see if I can simplify it. So the election laws in the state are really state matters for the most part. So if there's some evidence that the state has violated its laws, you would go to state court, and you could eventually end up in your state Supreme Court if it gets that far, about the state not following its own rules, or the state violating some of the laws or its own constitution. The only way it gets in federal court is if there's a violation of the federal Constitution in some way. And that's a much harder argument to make, right? Because the Constitution is sort of a broad document, right? In Bush versus Gore, the 2000 case, the argument was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, which, if you read the decision, was a somewhat of a reach. Most legal scholars would say to get to equal protection on that particular issue. But the short answer, what the point I'm trying to make is, you just can't go to the Supreme Court. There actually has to be an issue that has something to do with the federal Constitution. And remember, as I said before, the election of the electors in a state is primarily a state matter. So the U.S. Constitution doesn't necessarily get involved in this particular issue.
Well, just boil down, and I want to move on to Florida for a moment, but I would again ask you, we're getting a lot of vigorous comments, would be one way to describe it. If you all have specific questions for Professor Wagner about how the process will work as we all look at it, we're in the position in Florida where typically over many years, 2000 and certainly 2018 midterms and other times, we were looking at problems with the Florida process. It's worth noting that even with problems with the Florida process, there was never fraud alleged. It was questions about competence, about hanging chads. There's a big difference between competence and fraud. We had the hanging chads, we had old voting machines, we had problems with the count, but those were all issues of whether we had the right people in the right place to literally be able to do the job, but not whether or not they were trying to do the job anything less than honestly. And I think that's an important distinction. But nonetheless, as we look at Florida, I would ask for any of you who have specific questions for the professor. He's one of the best around when it comes to kind of explaining how the process works. Let's talk about Florida for a moment. It's 29 electoral votes. The president won by 1.5% here, 2016, and really upped that margin, if we can show those numbers again. Really, in Florida, did even better than that. He ended up, I think we had the overall number. I think it was somewhere closer to the order. There we go, 3+%. This time around, and owed that largely to outperforming outperforming his own numbers in heavily Cuban-American Miami-Dade in 2016. He outperformed this time, and talk about the message that allowed him to do that and why Democrats are really reeling today in the state of Florida.
Yeah, I think there's a big question that the Democratic Party of Florida will have to grapple with, which is, we always treat Florida as a battleground state, but increasingly the evidence suggests that Florida is a maybe a light red state, but increasingly a red state. And the problem for Democrats is that they have a broad coalition of groups that they need to successfully win a statewide election. And if they fail to garner basically support across their coalition, then they have problems. And I think we correctly identified that they had problems with Hispanic voters, especially in Miami-Dade, where Trump had a much closer He didn't win Miami-Dade, but he was much closer than.
Much closer, and Democrats needed to outperform, and Joe Biden didn't. We'll talk about the message about socialism that so resonated with Cuban American voters. We have a question again, and people ask this all the time. It's hard to see how Joe Biden could be even close. I'm paraphrasing slightly when you see so much red on the map. That's a matter of each state and its population, and therefore the number of electoral votes it is allotted. So if you look at California, 55 electoral votes in California, the biggest state in the union, 40 million plus people. Suzanne McIntyre saying, so hard to understand when you look at the map. It shows mostly red. How can blue be winning? Again, each state, based on its population and its congressional representation, gets that many electoral votes allotted. So California with 55, Texas, the next biggest state in the union population-wise, with 38, Florida coming up fast. Gosh, I remember when we were now we're tied for number 3 with New York. We have 29 electoral votes. Then you have Pennsylvania with 20, Ohio with 18, Illinois with 20, Michigan 16, Wisconsin, Minnesota. But you can see that it takes a couple of mega states with huge populations. It takes a lot of those red states with much smaller populations, therefore less electoral votes to match that number. How'd I do on that, Professor?
You did well. Let me see if I can help illustrate it to Suzanne a little bit. Do this with me since we have the map up there. Take a look at Wyoming. You see it in the the big square there right in the middle?
Yeah.
That's a big red spot on there, right? So just by the size of it, if we're looking at the map size, if we can go back to the map, and we're just looking at the map size, it looks like that should be, at least as important as something like Georgia or Alabama, right? By size-wise, right? But the population of Wyoming, I'm gonna get myself in trouble here, but I think it's roughly about 500,000.
Yeah, it's about 500,000 people.
Yeah. The population of Palm Beach County, which isn't even big enough to really be distinguishable on the map, is about 1.2 or 1.3 million, right? Mm-hmm. So there's so many more people in Palm Beach County than there is in Wyoming. So if we just look at geographical area, yeah, the map looks redder. But remember, it's not trees that vote, it's people, right? And so what you're looking for is the largest populations. And that tells you a little bit more about who wins and who loses. Remember, California is a very, very big state when it comes to population. About roughly 1 out of 8 Americans is a Californian. So there's a lot of people that live there. And that's why they have a disproportionately large impact on the electoral college.
Talk a little bit more. And again, welcome your questions. If you have specific questions, that was an excellent one because you do see the map covered in a lot of red and you've gone, The socialism message, Democrats acknowledged to me last night, we didn't have an answer for that. We sort of thought that message would go away. And we didn't appreciate in Florida how much that message would resonate, certainly in Miami-Dade County, which helped President Trump secure his second win in Florida, of course, winning in 2016. And Democrats acknowledged that they're in some real disarray, and it's going to probably be some pretty loud postmortems in the days to come. And as you answer that, continue to bring your questions to me as you can, either about process moving forward in other states, because there are legal battles ongoing. We welcome your specific questions about that and any questions about Florida. But answer the question I put to you, Professor.
Yeah, I think your explanation is right on. I do think that the Trump administration and the president spent a lot of time creating a foundation for that message, and I don't think people spent a lot of time thinking about it. But he went to Miami-Dade, and if you'll remember, and I know you will because you covered a lot of these stories. The president was down here talking about socialism in Venezuela. He was talking about he took affirmative steps against in switching U.S. policy towards Cuba. He spent a lot of time building the foundation for that message. And Democrats came in, recognized the problem a little bit late, and they started to come in late into Miami-Dade to try and do that. But one of the things we know in politics is it's not the first time you hear something that makes the impact. It's when you hear it 5, 6, 7, 8 times. And by the time Democrats were aware that they had a problem, they were just a little bit late in addressing it.
To talk for those who just join us, because we have people come in and out of forums like this, and we appreciate all of you being with us right now. Professor, step back and try and just sort of wrap your arms around the kind of concerns you hear about, the emotional comments on both sides, and try and help people just sort of step back, understand where we are, where we're going, and the perspective, given some of the charges being made on all sides about the sanctity of the election. Your belief, as you've expressed, that it's an election that while the rules may be different, we've seen nothing that suggests it's anything other than efforts, however halting, and sometimes perhaps not properly or as well organized as possible, but efforts nonetheless to legally count the vote. And I think it's most important for those just joining us, talk about what gives you confidence, as I believe it does, that we will have a legally counted vote that will decide one way or the other, whether it's President Trump or Joe Biden. What gives you that confidence?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is a fair critique to look at the way that we select our president and have some complaints about that, right? If you believe everybody's vote counts the same, maybe you might favor a direct popular vote, or you don't like the way that Florida does its rules and you think California does them better. I think those are legitimate critiques and things that we can change. When we go and petition our government, our state government, we want more of this or that. That is fair. I think where it gets a little more difficult is when if the election isn't going the way that you like it, you assume that there must be malfeasance because that's the only way that you could be losing. And I think that is a product of sort of modern society where we spend a lot of time inside our own sort of internet filter bubbles. And when you hear everybody say, well, our side's going to win, our side's going to win, our side's going to win, there's no way we're not going to win. If your side doesn't win, then it is natural to believe, well, there must have been something, malicious so that we didn't win. But more often than not, I think we just have to take a step back and take a deep breath and realize that there are, no matter which side of this election you're on, there are tens of millions of people who passionately disagree with you. And that's politics.
And Jody Ann asked another one for you, another question. Since it's the first 270 that wins, doesn't that, she asked, disregard the votes of millions of people just because their state was slow in counting votes? If all the votes are in, she goes on to say, and Mr. Biden reaches 271st, she asked, and then Trump ends up with more than 270. They both mathematically can't end up with 270. There's only 538 available. So you could end up in a 269 tie, but you can't end up with both of them, Jody, having 270 because there's 538 to give. But her point is, will some ballots, to her larger point, since it's first to 270 that wins, will some people end up who bothered to vote not have their vote count because somebody got to 270 while their vote in perhaps a smaller state still sitting there waiting to be counted?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd put it quite like that, Jody, because primarily, remember, there's no official totals until a little bit later. Yeah. So for the most part, wherever you vote, your vote's going to be counted and it's going to count. A running joke used to be that, a lot of times the elections were over before the state of Hawaii even got to vote, right? So
let me ask you a specific question. Rachel asked, what's the status for Senate and House seats? At last check, Republicans looked like they were going to hang on to the Senate. The House will stay Democratic. But although some seats, notable seats in Miami-Dade lost there by Democrats, again, the socialist message there really drove a lot of the vote to Republicans in Miami. But to the larger question, the status for the Senate and House, and talk about how a Republican-led Senate, if it ends up staying that way, we're still waiting for the vote to be certified. I want to be very careful. The House will stay Democratic. We'll see what the margins are. Talk about what you're seeing and what it means for government. Let's use the scenario that Joe Biden does go on to win. We don't know that, but for the moment, talk about that potential scenario.
Yeah, I think, and I wish I could tell you something more positive than this, but I think the likely result is a lot of gridlock, which we've seen a lot of already. Which is to say, you can't pass a law unless it passes both the House and the Senate. And there's such a division between our parties and disagree on so many foundational issues. I think the likelihood is that you will see once again that Congress is not able to achieve a lot. Now, one of the things Joe Biden has said, and I guess we'll get to test him on this if he turns out to be the winner, is that he says that he's capable of talking to and reaching agreement with Republican senators. He says he knows them, he's worked with them a long time, that he can get them to agree. I don't know. The evidence is really, that party really is driving a lot of this. So I'll believe it when I see it, but I guess we can all hope for the best. But I think the honest answer is that we're likely to have a lot of gridlock. The
Ronald Reagan, Tip O'Neill days, the Republican president and the Democratic leader of the House back in the day getting along, and the stories about how they could meet across the aisle are a bygone day, it would seem right now. Final thoughts, sir, and any final questions from any of you all? But right now, we see the 51 seats needed for control of the Senate. We're at 48 for the GOP, 46 for Dems. Again, votes being counted. Obviously, Florida did not have a Senate race. We had no statewide races on the ballot this time around in Florida. We had some big congressional races going on in our area and the like, but no other than that. We're still at 253 electoral votes and counting for Mr. Biden. And that's from the NBC projection. They're being very careful before they allot states here. Tonight, watch how Arizona and Nevada play out. Again, legal action in the blue wall states, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. President's team, Rudy Giuliani, say we may just file suits all over the nation. How practical is that, by the way, first of all, and then give us your closing perspective and comments, sir.
Yeah, it's not terribly practical. They'd be better off picking one or two areas where they think they have the best case to make, and to make that case. When you file it all over the place, it really sort of dilutes the effort that you're making. If they have a legitimate claim to make, they should focus on those particular ones. I think the message, it's been a stressful few days. People are very, very passionate about their politics, and here in South Florida in particular, because the president makes his home around here. You've seen a lot of passionate people, flags waving, people getting on corners, all kinds of interesting sort of engagement in the system. So if your candidate doesn't win, people feel very, disappointed or very engaged, or if their candidate does win, they feel very happy about it. I think the big thing to remember is that, democracy isn't about one election. It's about a process. If you don't win this election, the great thing about the United States is there's an election 2 years later, and there's another presidential election 4 years later. The people are consulted regularly, so nobody loses forever, and nobody wins forever.
I have to ask you, because I noticed when I look up and on both sides of the ledger here, when I see some of the comments pouring across platforms like this, as one writer said, sometimes it seems like anti-social media. Some of the vitriol and outright vulgarity of comments pouring through here. How do you govern a country when we're constantly at war with each other, it seems, politically speaking, on social media? How does anybody govern?
It's really hard.
A Trump or a Joe Biden or a local legislator, because I'm always taken aback on both sides of it. Some of the comments here really set me on my heels, and that's not reserved for one party or the other. It's stunning to me. But Professor, it's not really something to laugh about. It's really scary.
I wasn't trying to poke fun at it. I smile because I wrote basically a book about it called Tweeting to Power, and talk about how social media, which was supposed to bring us together in many ways, has isolated us, and has given us sort of a, if you go back to the old days of news, right? There was a collective news that we used to get. For example, there were only 3 major stations, so everybody sort of watched Walter Cronkite, and so we might disagree about what the news meant, but we didn't spend a lot of time arguing about the underlying news itself. The social media universe has created just an amazing amount of news that we can consume. And one of the things that we've discovered about human nature is that more often than not, if we have the choice, we go to news sources that tell us what we want to hear, right? That reinforce our beliefs. And because the internet allows us to do that really at a scale that we've never seen before, we create sort of universes where people don't crisscross, right? They don't engage with each other in an honest and fair kind of debate. And that's one of the reasons that we end up in a universe where no one's, the other side doesn't seem like just someone who disagrees with you about how to implement an issue. They seem like they must be a bad person because they're not part of the universe in which you're living in. And that's troubling. It's not funny. You're right. It is very troubling. And it creates an environment that makes it very hard for a democracy to function. I always, one of the things I always invite people to do is always take a moment, whenever you can, and watch a news source that is not typical for you. Read, something from an opinion author that is something that you may not agree with. And sometimes the only way you can convince yourself to do it is to tell you, do it because you just want to understand what the opposition is saying. But more often than not, there's a lot more that puts us together than takes us apart. And sometimes we get very, very stuck on the issues that we think separate us. But when you look at what the American people believe, there's red or blue, Democrat or Republican, many of the same issues are really important to the same people. How we choose to implement them, right? How we address them, that's a fair debate, but it doesn't have to be a debate out of anger. It can just be a debate out of policy, right?
Bottom line, Professor Kevin Wagner, head of Florida Atlantic University's Political Science Department. Patience, every indication that legally cast votes are being counted, every indication that we'll have enough lawyers on both sides to make sure that that is the case, and to let the process work. And I think that's a fair summation of much of what you've said tonight. We have to be patient, let the process play, and have faith that there are enough backstops to make sure that whatever side you're on, you can be assured there are plenty of eyes on it to make sure that at the end of the day, all legally cast votes, and every state has their rules about when votes can come in and be tallied, but that they will be counted and tallied, and then we'll know for certain and finally who will be the next president of the United States. Kevin Wagner, last 30-second comment.
Yeah, I think patience is really important here. I know there's a desire to know all the outcomes and everything, but in close races, I've always said the most important thing is make sure you get it right, not the quickest, but make sure you get it right. So I mean, there's plenty of time between now and when the Electoral College meets to cast their votes. So we don't have to rush through it and make mistakes. Count the votes, make sure every American that voted has their voice heard, and then we'll see the result.
Sir, we so much appreciate you taking time to speak to us. We thank you very much. And we appreciate you being with us. As always, Kevin Wagner, familiar face who knows Florida politics as well as anybody I know. We'll talk about polling next time. We didn't get to that. One of your
I was waiting for you.
What are your favorite topics? Well, we had plenty of, well, you know what? Okay, let me ask you, but you get 1 minute, because a lot of people are grumbling, boy, the polls were way off, and that pollsters all need to just quit their day jobs. Was the polling as bad as many people are saying it was?
Yeah,
and I know you do polling, but step away from the own polling you all do. How good or bad was it? A lot of people saying pretty bad.
Yeah, I mean, there were clearly some polls that were very erroneous. The one that had Biden up 17, and I think actually I won't name who I think that was because I might get it wrong. And but in Wisconsin, that was clearly, that was pretty far off. I would just point out this. I said to a friend of mine before the election on Tuesday that there's, despite the way it's being characterized, that there is a pathway for the president to win this that doesn't really have to have a lot of polling error. And if you remember that the races in Arizona, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina were all very close within the margin of error. So it didn't strike me as that unlikely or impossible for either Biden or Trump to sweep those states if they had the right momentum. So I think part of it is misinterpretation. Part of it is definitely there were some polls that were erroneous, but I think we'll have a better idea of how, where the polling was off and the mistakes that were or were not made, with a little patience, at least a few weeks for people to go over the data.
Sir, we really thank you for your time and your expertise and insight as always. Don't get far away. I know we'll be talking to you plenty in the weeks to come to help us navigate through this. We appreciate it. Professor Kevin Wagner, Florida Atlantic University, heading up their political science department. I'm Michael Williams. We thank you for being aboard with us tonight. Thank you for your questions as always. We'll be doing more of this in the days and weeks to come. So keep the questions coming, and we'll all one step at a time ask questions to the experts like Professor Wagner and others as we look through how it all plays out on the road to 270. But we'll conclude by saying that at least for Florida, it was a smooth ride and road getting the count in for Florida, which gave its 29 electoral votes to President Donald Trump. We'll see how the rest plays out. Good evening to you, Professor, and good evening to all of you at home.